On an isolated property, an elderly woman digs her own grave under threat from her daughter-in-law, who has lost control. But when everything seemed sealed by tragedy, a silent gesture of courage turns the tables. And from the depths of that grave, something no one expected is born, a new beginning for an entire family. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The morning light streamed through the enormous windows of the mansion in Scarsdale, illuminating every room with the almost artificial brightness of a place that had never known the dimness of simple homes. Carmen watched the sun's reflection on the Italian marble floors as she held a fine china teacup between fingers, calloused from decades of sewing. Everything there shone too brightly, sounded too distant. She still hadn't gotten used to the luxurious silence that filled every corner of the house. A different kind of silence from the one she had known her whole life, where the hum of the sewing machine was the soundtrack to her days, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of homemade bread. It had been almost a year since Robert, her only son, had insisted she leave her modest little house in Buffalo and come live with him, his wife Julianne, and their grandson Matthew in New York. The offer came wrapped in filial love and gratitude. Robert would repeat, always emotional, that it was his turn to take care of her, after all the time she had held the world on her shoulders so he could study, grow, and succeed. And succeed he had. The owner of a tech company. That was growing non-stop. Robert had become a successful man, recognized and respected. But to Carmen, her son was still that boy with big eyes who slept cuddled up to her on cold nights when the money barely covered the electric bill. She had accepted the move out of love, not for the comfort, not for the luxury she never asked for, but for the chance to be close to her son and grandson. Matthew. The boy was the reason for her smile during those difficult days of adjustment. At 8 years old, with perpetually messy brown hair and deep eyes that seemed to see beyond what children usually see, Matthew had something special about him. He was a quiet, introspective child who spent hours drawing or reading alone. He wasn't like the other children Carmen had known throughout her life. He had his own silent world, full of details only he noticed, and it was with her that Matthew opened up. With his grandmother, he talked about the things he drew, the characters he invented, the sounds that bothered him, and the textures he couldn't stand to touch. Carmen didn't understand everything, but she understood the essential part. The boy needed someone to listen to him without rushing, without judgment, and she was there for that. Every afternoon, after he got back from his private school on the Upper East Side, the two would meet in the spacious kitchen. She would bake cornbread, his favorite, while Matthew drew in his notebook, leaning against the granite countertop. They spoke little, but each other's presence was enough. It was a sacred ritual, an invisible bond that united two generations and two completely different worlds. But not everything was harmonious in that house of white walls and designer furniture. Carmen felt from the very first days that something didn't fit. Julianne, Robert's wife, was an elegant woman, always impeccable, in designer clothes and with perfectly styled hair. She worked as an image consultant for female executives and socialites, traveled frequently, and kept a full schedule. She was polite to her mother-in-law, but distant. There was a calculated coldness in every gesture, in every word. No over-the-top affection, no warm hugs. Julianne was practical, objective, modern, as Robert liked to explain. What bothered Carmen most, however, wasn't her daughter-in-law's coldness toward her. It was her coldness toward Matthew. Julianne treated her own son as if he were an appointment in her calendar. She asked about school, checked if he had eaten, made sure the private tutors were on schedule, but there was no affection. There wasn't that motherly gaze that melts at the sight of her child's smile. There were no kisses on the forehead before bed, no comforting lap on tough days. Matthew never complained, but Carmen saw in the boy's silence a sadness he couldn't name. One afternoon, while baking the usual cornbread, Carmen dared to bring it up with Robert. He was in the living room answering emails on his laptop, but she approached slowly, drying her hands on the apron she insisted on wearing, even with 3 housekeepers in the house. "Robert, honey, can I tell you something?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost asking for permission to exist. Robert looked up from the screen, smiling. "Of course, Mom. What is it?" Carmen hesitated. She didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law so often ridiculed in movies, but her concern for Matthew was greater than her fear of bothering him. "It's about Julianne and Matthew," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I know it's none of my business, but I've noticed she's a bit cold with the boy. He's so affectionate, so sensitive, and it seems like she doesn't show much affection for him." Robert sighed, but he didn't seem surprised or offended. "Mom, Julianne is just different. She's not the type to coddle him, you know. She was raised that way in a more reserved family, but she loves Matthew, in her own way. It's just a more modern way of being a mom." Carmen wanted to say that a mother's love doesn't have a modern or old-fashioned way. It either exists or it doesn't. But she swallowed her words and nodded, returning to the kitchen with a heavy heart. Robert was a good man, hard-working, generous, but he was blind to certain things, or preferred to be. The days continued in that strange routine where luxury and emptiness mixed. Carmen tried to find her place in that giant house. She woke up early, even with nothing to do. The staff took care of everything. The food was prepared by a hired chef. The clothes were washed and ironed by another employee. Carmen felt useless. Her whole life had been defined by work, by busy hands, by the daily struggle. And now, surrounded by comfort, she felt she had lost her own identity. Who was she without her sewing machine, without her orders, without the hustle? She was just an old woman, out of place in a house that wasn't hers. The only time she truly felt alive was when Matthew came home from school. The boy would walk in the door, drop his backpack in the hall, and run to the kitchen looking for his grandmother. "Grandma, I'm here," he'd announce, always with that shy half-smile, and Carmen would smile back, feeling that there in that small ritual was the reason she had accepted the move. One day Matthew brought a new drawing. It was a huge tree full of twisted branches, and on each branch was a different bird. He explained, with the seriousness of someone presenting an important project, that each bird represented an emotion. There was the blue bird of calm, the red one of anger, the yellow one of joy. Carmen listened attentively, impressed by the depth of that little boy. "You're very smart, Matthew," she said, stroking his hair. "Very special." "My teacher says I'm different," he replied, looking at the drawing. "She said I see the world in a unique way. And that's a good thing, my angel. Being different is a gift." Matthew smiled, but there was a shadow in that smile. "My mum doesn't think so." Carmen felt her chest tighten. "Why do you say that?" "Because she gets mad when I take too long to do things, or when I don't like some food because of the texture. She says I need to be more normal." "Normal," Carmen repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "Matthew, listen to me. There's no right way to be. You're perfect just the way you are. And your mother loves you, she just doesn't know how to show it right." The boy didn't answer, but he moved closer to his grandmother and rested his head on her shoulder. Carmen hugged him, feeling that hug was the most important thing she would do that day, that week, maybe in her entire life. The weeks passed, and the feeling of strangeness grew. Carmen began to observe the dynamics of the house more closely. She noticed that Julianne and Robert barely talked when they were together. Dinners in silence, each on their own phone. Robert worked late. Julianne left early for meetings. Matthew was left with nannies and tutors, and Carmen was there, an invisible witness to a family that seemed united only on paper. One night, unable to sleep, Carmen went down to the kitchen to make some chamomile tea. The house was silent, lit only by the automatic lights in the hallways. As she passed the living room, she heard muffled voices coming from Robert's office. The door was ajar. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but the tone of the conversation caught her attention. It was Julianne, and she was on the phone. Carmen stopped in the hallway, her heart pounding without knowing why. There was something in Julianne's tone that put her on high alert. It wasn't just coldness. It was tension. Fear, perhaps. I know, Julianne was saying, her voice low but charged with emotion. But it's not that simple. He can't find out now, not after all this time. It would destroy everything. Carmen felt a shiver run down her spine. What was Julianne talking about? Who couldn't find out what? Julianne continued. I did what I had to do back then. I had no other choice. And now, all these years later, I won't let anything ruin what we've built. Do you understand? Nothing. There was a pause. Carmen was barely breathing, pressed against the hallway wall. Yes, I know there are risks, Julianne went on, her voice more tense. But as long as no one suspects anything, it's fine. The boy is happy, Robert is happy, and I have the life I always wanted. I'm not going to lose that. Carmen felt her legs go weak. What was this secret? What had Julianne done? And the boy Matthew, what did he have to do with it? Before she could process it, she heard footsteps approaching the office door. On impulse, Carmen moved away quickly, climbing the stairs back to her room, her heart racing. She lay in bed, her mind in a whirlwind. She tried to convince herself she had misunderstood, that she was jumping to conclusions, but deep down, a persistent voice told her that something was very wrong in that house. In the following days, Carmen couldn't get that conversation out of her head. She watched Julianne with new eyes, looking for signs, clues, to what might be hidden. And the more she watched, the more she noticed small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Julianne avoided talking about her own family. She never had relatives over. The few wedding photos around the house showed only the couple and some friends. No father, no mother, no siblings. When Robert mentioned something about his in-laws, Julianne would quickly change the subject, always with the excuse that her family was distant, complicated, that it wasn't worth getting into details. And there was something else. Matthew looked nothing like Julianne, or Robert. The boy had delicate features, almond-shaped eyes, and hair that was straighter and darker than the couple's. Carmen had never thought about it before, always attributing the differences to unpredictable genetics. But now, with that conversation hammering in her mind, the pieces were starting to fit together in a disturbing way. One afternoon, while Matthew was drawing in the kitchen and Carmen was baking the usual cornbread, she decided to ask some questions, carefully, without raising suspicion. Matthew, have you ever seen pictures of when you were a baby? She asked, feigning disinterest as she stirred the batter. The boy stopped drawing and thought for a moment. I don't think so. My mom says she lost the photos when she got a new phone. And from the hospital? That little box moms keep with the bracelet, the birth certificate? Matthew shrugged. I don't know. I've never seen that. Carmen forced a smile, but inside her heart was racing again. It was too strange. Every mother keeps those things. Every mother has pictures of her baby in the first few days, unless there were no pictures, unless there was no bracelet, unless Matthew hadn't been born in that hospital or from that womb. The elderly woman mentally scolded herself. She was going crazy, seeing problems where there might be none. But something inside her, that sharp mother's intuition that had spent a lifetime protecting her son alone, screamed that her suspicions were not unfounded. A few days later, fate delivered the confirmation that Carmen both feared and sought. It was a hot Saturday afternoon. Robert had traveled to Chicago for work. Julianne was home but spent most of her time in her office or on the phone. Carmen decided to bake a more elaborate cake for Matthew and realized she was out of sugar. She went down to the pantry, searching the organized shelves. That's when she heard Julianne's voice in the garden, on the phone again. The kitchen windows overlooked the backyard, and the wind carried the words to where Carmen stood. She froze, the bag of sugar forgotten in her hand, listening intently. No, you don't need to worry, Julianne was saying, pacing back and forth among the garden's towering oaks. Everything is under control. No one will ever find out. The documents are perfect, the story is solid. He is officially our son. Carmen felt the floor disappear from under her feet. Julianne continued. It was the best decision I ever made. Faking the pregnancy was easier than I imagined. Some loose clothes, a few forged test results, and that was it. Robert believed everything. And when the time came, you got the baby. Just right. The right age, with the right papers. Nobody asks questions when you have money. Carmen had to lean on the counter to keep from falling. Her legs were trembling. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint right there. Matthew, her grandson. The boy she loved with every fibre of her being. He wasn't her grandson by blood. He wasn't Robert's son. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed sham. Julianne was still talking. I needed to lock Robert down, you understand. He was starting to have doubts about the marriage, thinking something was missing. A child solved everything. He fell in love with the boy, built his whole life around him. Now, the marriage is secure. My life is secure. And the boy, well, he has everything he needs. It's a fair trade. Carmen felt nauseous. She had to get out of there, had to process it all. She went up to her room in a daze, locked the door and sat on the bed, her hands shaking. She cried in silence, covering her mouth to muffle the sound. She cried for the lie, for the betrayal, for Robert who was living a lie without knowing it. But most of all, she cried for Matthew. That sweet, sensitive boy who was guilty of nothing, who had been used as a bargaining chip in a cruel game of self-interest. And now what? What should she do? Tell Robert and destroy the family? Stay silent and be an accomplice to a heinous lie? Carmen had no answer. She only had pain, and the certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The following days were the most difficult of Carmen's life. Every family meal, every moment of apparent normalcy, carried the unbearable weight of that secret. She looked at Robert and saw a happy, dedicated man, in love with the son he believed was his. She looked at Matthew and saw an innocent boy who had no idea of the web of lies that sustained his existence in that family. And she looked at Julianne and saw a stranger, a woman capable of constructing such an elaborate farce that she had managed to deceive everyone for years. Carmen tried to convince herself that it might be better to leave things as they were. After all, Robert was happy. Matthew had everything he needed. Revealing the truth would be like setting off a bomb. It would destroy her son, traumatize her grandson, and tear that family apart. But every time she tried to resign herself to silence, a voice inside her cried out that a lie was a lie, no matter how comfortable. And Robert had the right to know, the right to decide for himself what to do with that information. The nights became endless. Carmen would lie in the huge bed of the guest room and stare at the ceiling for hours, her heart heavy. She remembered her life in Buffalo, when her worries were different. Paying the bills, getting sewing orders, making sure Robert had clean clothes and food on the table. Simple, concrete problems that could be solved with hard work and persistence. Now she faced a moral dilemma with no easy solution. A dilemma that, regardless of her choice, would bring suffering. Matthew noticed that something was different with his grandmother. One afternoon after school, he came into the kitchen and found Carmen distracted, staring out the window at nothing. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked, his small voice filled with concern. Carmen turned, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, my angel. Just a little tired." Matthew didn't seem convinced. He had that strange ability to perceive things that others missed. "You seem sad." Carmen knelt to his level, taking his hands in hers. "Sometimes grown-ups get worried about things, but it passes. You don't need to worry about me. Come on, let's make our cornbread." But as they mixed the batter together, Carmen felt the weight of the boy's gaze. Matthew was special, sensitive, intuitive, and she knew she couldn't hide for long that something was wrong. The following week, Julianne began to act strangely. She was more attentive, more present at home, observing Carmen with an attention she hadn't shown before. The elderly woman realized that her daughter-in-law had noticed the change in her behavior. There was something in Julianne's eyes, a mixture of suspicion and alarm, that made Carmen even more nervous. It was as if the two were playing a silent game, each knowing the other held a dangerous secret. One morning, Julianne appeared in the kitchen while Carmen was having coffee alone. It was unusual. Julianne usually had a green juice in her room while getting ready for the day. "Good morning, Carmen," she said, her tone polite but laden with something indefinable. "Did you sleep well?" "I did, thank you," Carmen replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Julianne poured herself a coffee and sat at the table, which was also unusual. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about how you've adjusted here. It must be hard, right, leaving the life you've known forever and coming to such a different place." Carmen sipped her coffee on alert. "It's an adjustment, yes, but I'm here for Robert and Matthew." Julianne smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, Matthew adores you. You two have a very strong bond. Sometimes I even think he tells you things he doesn't tell us." Carmen felt a chill run down her spine. Children like to talk to their grandparents. It's normal. "Yes," Julianne agreed, stirring her coffee slowly. "I just hope these conversations are about kid stuff, cartoons, games. Nothing that could, I don't know, put confusing ideas in his head." The message was delivered. Julianne was warning her in a veiled way that Carmen should not meddle. She should not ask questions. She should not plant doubts. The elderly woman perfectly understood the implicit threat in those carefully chosen words. "I only talk about kid stuff," Carmen replied, holding Julianne's gaze. "I'm not one to stir up trouble." "Good," Julianne said, getting up from the table, "because trouble is the last thing this family needs, and I'm sure you agree." After Julianne left, Carmen remained frozen in her chair, her heart racing. Her daughter-in-law knew. She knew that she had discovered something, and that conversation was a clear warning. Stay quiet, or there will be consequences. Carmen didn't know exactly what those consequences would be, but the coldness in Julianne's eyes made it clear she wasn't bluffing. That night when Robert came home from work, Carmen almost gave in. She almost went to him and told him everything. But when she saw him hug Matthew, lift the boy into the air, and cover him with kisses while they both laughed, she couldn't. How could she destroy that? How could she take away Robert's joy of being a father? How could she explain that the last years of his life were built on a lie? It was too heavy, too cruel. But silence was also cruel, and Carmen felt torn between two paths, both painful. The days grew more tense. Julianne increased her surveillance of Carmen. She was always nearby, always watching, always with that calculating gaze. The kitchen conversations between grandmother and grandson now had a silent witness. Julianne would show up with flimsy excuses, grab something from the fridge, check the menu with the chef, invent any reason to be there. Carmen understood the message. "Be careful what you say. I'm watching." Matthew felt the tension in the air, even without understanding what was happening. He became quieter, more withdrawn. The drawings that were once colorful began to take on darker tones. One afternoon he drew a tree with no leaves, just twisted branches. When Carmen asked about the drawing, he replied that sometimes trees lose their leaves when they get sad. His grandmother had to leave the kitchen to cry in secret. All of this was affecting the boy. The tension in the house, the heavy atmosphere, Julianne's constant watchful presence. Matthew absorbed it all in the sensitive and profound way that was characteristic of him, and Carmen felt powerless. Any move she made could make the situation worse. On a Thursday afternoon, Robert came home early. A meeting had been cancelled, and he decided to spend the rest of the day with his family. He found Matthew drawing in the living room, Carmen crocheting on the sofa, and Julianne in her office on the phone, as usual. "Hey, champ," Robert said, sitting next to his son. "What are you drawing today?" Matthew showed him the drawing. It was a house with several windows, each showing a different person. But the people weren't looking at each other. Each was facing a different direction. Robert studied the drawing, intrigued. "And who are these people?" Matthew shrugged. "People who live in the same house but in different worlds." Robert exchanged a look with Carmen, who pretended to be focused on her crochet. There was something disturbing about that drawing. A truth the child was expressing without knowing he was revealing the state of their family. "Are you feeling lonely, Matthew?" Robert asked, his voice filled with concern. "Sometimes," the boy admitted. "But Grandma stays with me. She understands me." Robert smiled and looked at his mother. "Yeah, your grandma is special. Always has been. She's the one who taught me that family is about being present, not about having things." Carmen felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scream that family was also about truth, about honesty, but she swallowed her words and continued to crochet, her fingers trembling. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Carmen couldn't close her eyes. She got up, went down to the kitchen and made some tea. She was sitting alone, looking at the garden, illuminated by the outdoor lights when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Her heart leaped. It was Julianne. Her daughter-in-law entered the kitchen, wearing a silk robe, her hair down. She sat at the table without asking, staring at Carmen with that cold look she was learning to fear. "Can't sleep?" Julianne asked, but it wasn't really a question. Carmen took a sip of her tea, not answering. "Me neither," Julianne continued. "I lie awake thinking about a lot of things, about how fragile life can be, you know. How everything we've built can fall apart with one wrong word, one piece of information in the wrong place." Carmen stared at her. "What do you want, Julianne?" The woman smiled, but it was a dangerous smile. "I want us to have an understanding. You found something out. I know you did. I see it in your eyes, in the way you avoid me, how you get nervous when I'm around." Carmen didn't deny it. It would be pointless. "So, I'll be clear," Julianne said, leaning forward. "Whatever you've discovered, keep it to yourself. Robert is happy. Matthew is happy. I provide a good life for everyone. Why ruin that?" "Because it's a lie," Carmen answered, her voice firm despite her fear. "Robert deserves to know the truth." "The truth?" Julianne laughed, a humorless sound. "The truth will destroy him. It will destroy Matthew. It will destroy this family. Is that what you want? Destruction?" "I want justice." "Justice," Julianne repeated, her tone bitter. "There's no perfect justice in this world, Carmen. There are only choices, and you need to choose. Stay quiet and preserve your family's happiness, or open your mouth and watch it all fall apart, including your relationship with Robert and Matthew." The threat was clear now. If Carmen told, Julianne would do everything to turn Robert and Matthew against her. She would paint the elderly woman as confused, senile, making up stories. And with her power of persuasion, with her control over the family's life, she would probably succeed. Carmen felt tears burn in her eyes. "You have no heart. You used a baby as a tool." Julianne stood up, looking down at her. "I gave that boy a life he never would have had. I gave Robert the joy of being a father. And yes, I secured my stability in the process. Everybody won. The only person who can ruin this is you. So think very carefully before you make any decision." With that, Julianne left the kitchen, leaving Carmen alone with her cold tea and her shattered heart. The elderly woman cried there, in the silent kitchen, feeling the crushing weight of the situation. She was trapped. She couldn't speak without terrible consequences, but she couldn't stay silent without betraying Robert. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Robert left early for work. Matthew went to school. Julianne had meetings out of the office, and Carmen was left alone in the big house, wandering through the rooms like a ghost. She felt trapped in a golden cage, where every luxurious wall was also an impossible barrier to cross. In the late afternoon, when Matthew returned, she tried to act normally. They made the usual cornbread. They talked about cartoons. But there was a sadness in the air that not even the boy could ignore. "Grandma, are you going to leave?" he asked suddenly, his big eyes fixed on her. Carmen felt her heart ache. "Why are you thinking that, my angel?" "Because you seem sad here, and when people get sad, they leave." Carmen pulled her grandson into a tight hug. "I'm not leaving. I'm here for you. I always will be." Matthew nestled into the hug, and Carmen felt tears stream silently down her face. She would do anything to protect that boy. But how could she protect him when the biggest threat came from inside their own home, from his own mother? The days passed in a tense routine. Carmen tried to maintain normalcy, but she felt like she was living on a ticking time bomb. At any moment, something could explode. Julianne kept up her surveillance, always present, always in control, and Carmen felt more and more suffocated. It was then, on a Friday afternoon, that Julianne announced during dinner that she had planned a surprise for the weekend. "We're going on a family trip," she said, smiling. "To my family's place up in the Catskills. It's a beautiful, quiet place. It'll be great for us to relax, spend some time together." Robert loved the idea. "That's great, honey. It's been a while since we've taken a weekend just for us." Matthew looked at his grandmother, as if seeking approval. "Are you coming too, Grandma?" Carmen wanted to say no. She wanted to make up an excuse. But Julianne was staring at her with that icy, challenging look, and she understood that she had no choice. Julianne was moving the pieces on the board, and Carmen, for some reason she couldn't define, felt a deep fear of what was to come. "Of course I'm coming," she replied, forcing a smile. "It'll be nice." But inside, a voice screamed that none of it would be nice, that she was walking into a trap, and that maybe, this time, there would be no way out. The drive up to the Catskills was long and silent. Robert drove focused, occasionally commenting on the traffic or a sign on the highway. Julianne was in the passenger seat, scrolling on her phone, seemingly calm. Matthew and Carmen were in the back. The boy looked out the window, watching the landscape change from urban to rural. Carmen pretended to read a book, but the words danced on the page without making sense. Her heart had been racing since they left Scarsdale. There was something wrong with this trip. She felt it in her gut, that intuition that had never failed her before. The night before, something had happened that had heightened her fear even more. She was lying in bed, trying unsuccessfully to sleep, when her phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. "Be careful. She knows that you know. Don't go to the property." Carmen read and reread the message, her hands trembling. Who had sent it? How did someone outside know what was happening? She thought about showing it to Robert, but how could she explain without revealing everything? She thought about not going, but how could she abandon Matthew? The boy would be alone with Julianne if she didn't go. No, she had to go. She had to be there, if only to protect her grandson in some way. After nearly 3 hours on the road, they turned onto an isolated rural property. An iron gate opened automatically when Julianne entered a code on her phone. The red dirt road wound for almost a mile before reaching the main house. It was an old renovated farmhouse, beautiful in its own way, but there was something oppressive about its solitude. There were no neighbors in sight, just woods, pasture, and silence. "What a beautiful place," Robert said, parking in front of the porch. "Is this really your family's, honey? I've never been here." "Yeah," Julianne replied, getting out of the car. "I inherited it a while ago, but I don't come here much. I thought it would be good for us to reconnect, away from the city rush." Matthew got out and stood close to his grandmother, grabbing her hand. Carmen squeezed her grandson's hand, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. The house was spacious inside. Rustic furniture, hardwood floors, large windows overlooking the pasture. There was a caretaker, a middle-aged man named Tony, who greeted everyone politely but kept a certain distance. Carmen noticed that he and Julianne exchanged significant glances, like people sharing a secret. A shiver ran down her spine. Robert was enchanted with the place. He spent the afternoon exploring the property with Matthew, showing his son the horses in the stable, the creek at the back of the land, the fruit trees in the orchard. Julianne stayed in the house, preparing dinner with Carmen, but it was a forced, tense help. The two women moved around the kitchen like opponents in a ring, each waiting for the other's next move. "It's going to be a quiet night," Julianne commented as she chopped vegetables. "No distractions, cell service is spotty here, just family." Carmen didn't answer, continuing to peel potatoes with hands that were no longer as steady as they once were. "You know, Carmen," Julianne continued, her tone too casual to be genuine, "I used to come here as a child. My grandmother lived in this house. She would tell me stories about the farm, about secrets buried in the earth. She used to say the earth keeps everything. Memories, secrets, truths that shouldn't come to light." Carmen felt her blood run cold. There was a veiled threat in those words. Julianne was warning her again. Stay quiet or face the consequences. Dinner was served on the porch, under a dark sky dotted with stars. Robert was cheerful, relaxed, happy to be with his family in a beautiful place. Matthew ate slowly, quietly, absorbing the atmosphere, and Carmen could barely swallow, her throat tight with anxiety. After dinner, Julianne made coffee for everyone. She brought the cups on a tray, serving with excessive attention. Carmen took her cup, brought it to her lips, but something made her hesitate. The aroma was strange. It wasn't just coffee. There was something else there, something slightly bitter that shouldn't be. When Julianne was distracted talking to Robert, Carmen discreetly poured the coffee into a plant next to the porch. She pretended to drink, wiping her lips with her napkin. And she saw Julianne watching her, a strange glint in her eyes. The night wore on, and everyone went to bed. Carmen lay in her assigned room, but didn't close her eyes. She stayed alert, listening to every sound of the old house. She heard Robert and Julianne talking in the next room, their voices muffled. She heard Matthew stirring in his bed in the other room. And she heard, in the dead of night, Julianne's bedroom door open and footsteps descending the stairs. Carmen got up slowly, her heart pounding. She went to the window and saw in the moonlight Julianne walking toward the back of the property. She was alone. She was carrying something, but it was hard to see what. The elderly woman knew she should stay in her room, stay quiet, not get involved. But something stronger pushed her. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the survival instinct screaming that she needed to know what was happening. She put on a coat over her pajamas and went down the stairs slowly, avoiding the creaky steps. She slipped out the kitchen door and followed in the direction Julianne had gone. The night was cold, the wind carrying the smell of damp earth and woods. A crescent moon provided just enough light for her to see the path. She followed a narrow trail that led to a more remote area of the house, and that's when she saw it. Ahead, partially lit by the moon, was a trench dug in the ground. It wasn't large, but it was deep, and next to it digging tools, a shovel, a hoe, a tarp. Carmen felt her legs go weak. This wasn't for a garden. This was something much worse. Julianne was there, her back to her, talking on the phone. Her voice reached Carmen in fragments from where she was hiding behind a tree. "Everything's ready," Julianne was saying. "Tomorrow morning, it'll look like an accident, an elderly, confused woman who wandered off alone at night and got lost. No one will question it." Carmen had to put her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Julianne was planning something against her. That trench, that hole in the ground was for her. The anonymous text was right. She shouldn't have come. But now she was here, alone, far from everything and everyone, on the isolated property of a woman capable of anything to protect her secrets. With her heart pounding, Carmen made her way back to the house as silently as possible. She went up to her room, locked the door, and dragged a chair to block it. She grabbed her phone, but as she had imagined, there was no signal. She was completely cut off. She couldn't call anyone, couldn't ask for help. Robert was asleep with no idea of the danger. So was Matthew. And she, a 70-year-old woman, was caught in a deadly trap. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat on the bed, planning. At dawn, she would go down and try to convince Robert to go back to New York. She would make up an excuse, say she wasn't feeling well, anything to get them out of there. But when the sun rose and she went down to the kitchen, she found only Julianne making breakfast. "Good morning, Carmen," she said, her tone sickeningly sweet. "Sleep well?" "Where's Robert?" Carmen asked, ignoring the question. "He left early with Matthew. They went to see the reservoir on the other side of the property. They'll be a couple of hours. It's a long walk." Carmen felt panic rise in her throat. Julianne had planned this, to get Robert and Matthew away, to leave her alone, vulnerable. "You know, Carmen," Julianne continued, pouring coffee into a cup, "I really wished it wouldn't come to this. I wished you had been sensible, but you just can't stay quiet, can you? You keep stewing, planning to tell Robert everything. I see it in your eyes." "I won't let you continue with this lie," Carmen said, her voice trembling but firm. Julianne laughed, a chilling sound. "You won't be able to do anything, because you won't be here to tell." The confrontation was open now. No more masks, no more pretense. It was the raw, terrifying truth. Julianne was willing to go to any length to protect her sham, and Carmen was alone, with no way out. "Let's take a walk," Julianne said. It wasn't an invitation, but an order. "I want to show you a beautiful part of the property." "I'm not going," Carmen replied, backing away. "Yes, you are," Julianne insisted, and there was something dangerous in her voice. "Because if you don't, I guarantee that when Robert gets back, he'll find you in a state he never imagined. And I'll tell him you had a breakdown, that you started saying nonsensical things, that you attacked me and Matthew. I'll make your son believe you've gone insane, and he'll have you committed. He'll remove you from his life and Matthew's forever." Carmen knew it wasn't a bluff. Julianne was capable of it, of manipulating the situation to make her look like the villain, the crazy one, the threat. So she followed. She left the house, walked across the property beside Julianne, and with every step she felt she was walking toward her own end. They passed the orchard, the empty stable, the pastures, and then they reached that remote area where the trench was open, waiting. "This is where my grandmother told me life's most important secrets," Julianne said, looking at the hole. "She taught me that sometimes to protect what we love we have to bury what threatens us." Carmen looked at that trench and saw her own grave. She saw the end of everything. But something inside her, that strength that had helped her survive so many difficult years, that courage of a woman who raised a son alone against all odds, wouldn't let her give up. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Robert will find out. Matthew will find out. The truth always comes out." Julianne stared at her, and for the first time, Carmen saw desperation behind the cold mask. It wasn't just malice, it was fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being left with nothing. Fear of going back to being a nobody. "I can't lose everything," Julianne said, her voice breaking. "I built this. I deserved this life. And you're not going to take it from me." In that moment, something shifted. Julianne lunged, pushing Carmen toward the trench. The elderly woman stumbled, felt the damp earth under her feet, her hands grasping at the edges for support. Julianne was screaming, crying, incoherent words about deserving, about justice, about having no other choice. And Carmen fought, screamed, tried to get out, her survival instinct shouting, louder than her fear. That's when they heard it, the sound of a revving engine, a car. Robert. Julianne froze, her eyes wide. How? They weren't supposed to be back yet, but the sound grew closer. And then Robert appeared, running down the trail, Matthew behind him. The boy had filmed it. He had seen Julianne preparing something strange early that morning, had sensed something was wrong, and he had sent a video to his father, a silent cry for help that saved his grandmother. Robert saw the scene. His mother on the ground, Julianne with dirt on her hands, the open trench, and he understood. He didn't need an explanation. Everything became clear in a terrible instant. He ran, pulled his mother out, and held her tightly as she cried and trembled. And Julianne fell to her knees, sobbing, her mask finally shattered, revealing only a desperate woman who had gone too far to protect a lie. What happened in the following hours was a blur. Police, the station, statements. Carmen in the hospital, being examined. Robert in shock. Matthew quiet, clinging to his father. And Julianne being taken away by the authorities, facing the consequences of her actions. The truth had come out in the worst possible way. But it had come out, and now there was no way to bury it. The hospital in New York smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. Carmen lay in a bed that was too clean, too white, connected to machines that monitored every beat of her tired heart. The bruises on her body ached less than the wounds in her soul. 3 days had passed since the incident at the property. 3 days in which she floated between the relief of being alive and the crushing weight of everything that had happened. Nurses came and went with mechanical efficiency, checking vital signs, changing IV bags, asking about her pain on a scale of 1 to 10. But how do you measure the pain of having faced your own death on a numerical scale? How do you quantify the trauma of discovering that a family member was capable of such cruelty? Robert had barely left the room. He sat in the chair next to his mother, held her hand, and cried softly when he thought she was asleep. But Carmen wasn't sleeping. She just closed her eyes to spare her son the embarrassment of being seen in pieces. She heard his stifled sobs, felt his hand tighten on hers, and her heart broke all over again. Not for herself, but for him. For having to carry the weight of discovering that the woman he had shared his life with for so many years was a stranger. For having to deal with the guilt of not having noticed. For having to choose between anger and grief for a relationship that had never truly existed. At the police station, when they were finally able to speak alone after the endless depositions, Robert learned everything. Carmen told him about the conversation she had overheard in the garden that night, about the discovery of the faked pregnancy and the illegal adoption. She told him about Julianne's veiled and explicit threats, about the fear that had paralyzed her for weeks, about the moral dilemma that had nearly destroyed her from the inside. She told him about the sleepless nights, the feeling of being trapped in a cage of lies, the desperation of not knowing how to protect everyone without destroying everything. And Robert listened in absolute silence, his face growing paler with each revelation, his hands trembling on the cold table of the interview room, his eyes losing the confident sparkle that had always characterized them. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. He just stared at his own hands as if they didn't belong to him, as if his whole body was alien now that the life he knew had been revealed as an illusion. The silence between mother and son was dense, heavy with everything that couldn't be said with words. Finally, in a hoarse voice, as if fighting not to fall apart right there, he said the words Carmen would never forget. Words that defined who Robert truly was at his core. "He's my son. Biology doesn't change that. I've loved him since the first day I held him in my arms. I took care of him when he was sick, taught him his first words, comforted him during nightmares. I am his father, and I always will be. Nothing, absolutely nothing, changes what I feel for that boy." Carmen cried then, not from sadness, but from immense, profound pride. Her son, the boy she had raised alone with so little, fighting against poverty and the prejudice of being a single mother, in a small town, had become such a man capable of separating love from genetics, capable of seeing beyond the deceit to the luminous truth of the heart, a man who knew that being a father was much more than sharing DNA. It was being present, it was loving unconditionally, it was choosing every day to be a family. Matthew, however, was different. The boy who had always been quiet and introspective, who lived in his private world of drawings and silent observations, was now completely withdrawn, enclosed in a protective shell that not even his grandmother could penetrate. He didn't speak, didn't draw, didn't smile. He spent hours sitting in the room Robert had temporarily rented near the hospital, staring out the window at nothing, lost in thoughts an 8-year-old shouldn't have to process. The psychologist Robert had hired in a hurry, a specialist in childhood trauma recommended by the hospital, explained with patience and empathy that the trauma of what Matthew had witnessed would require a great deal of time and specialized care to be properly processed. The boy had not only seen his beloved grandmother in mortal danger, but he had also discovered that his own mother, the woman who should have protected and loved him above all else, was capable of causing that danger. It was a betrayal on multiple levels, too complex for a child's mind to comprehend. It was too much, far too much for a child to carry alone. Robert made quick decisions, driven by a steely determination born of the desperation to protect what was left of his family. He hired the best criminal and family law attorneys money could buy, renowned professionals with impeccable track records. He immediately initiated all necessary legal proceedings to secure full and unconditional custody of Matthew, preparing for any possible challenge. He began a deep, detailed, and thorough investigation into the real story of the adoption, hiring private investigators and lawyers specializing in family law and searches. He wanted to understand where Matthew had really come from, who his biological parents were, if a family had been searching for him all these years, if there were other victims of the criminal network that had facilitated the illegal adoption. It was a painful search, each discovery like a new cut on still open wounds, but it was absolutely necessary. Matthew deserved to know his full and true story when he was emotionally ready to receive that information. Julianne, meanwhile, faced the devastating consequences of her actions alone. She was in custody awaiting trial, isolated from the world she had built with such care and manipulation. She would be prosecuted for several serious crimes, including forgery of public documents, identity fraud, illegal adoption of a minor, in addition to the attempt on Carmen's life, which the authorities were still debating how to legally classify. Her lawyer, an expensive but realistic professional, tried to negotiate plea bargains, citing a prolonged emotional breakdown, undiagnosed psychiatric disorders, pathological desperation, and all manner of mitigating circumstances. But the truth was crystal clear and undeniable, documented in depositions, messages, and physical evidence. She had built an entire life, for years and years, on elaborate lies, And when that fragile construction began to crack and crumble, she had chosen the darkest, most desperate path, unable to accept the loss of what had never been truly hers. A week after the incident, after tests, observation, and intensive care, Carmen was discharged from the hospital. The bruises were starting to turn yellow, signs of physical healing. She returned to the mansion in Scarsdale with Robert and Matthew, but nothing, absolutely nothing, was the same. The house felt completely different, as if the very walls had absorbed the tragedy and changed their essence. The luxurious rooms, once oppressive in their intimidating grandeur, were now just empty spaces patiently waiting to be filled with new meanings, new memories to replace the old ones marked by lies. Robert was different too, transformed by the crisis, more present in every moment, more attentive to every emotional detail, more human in his vulnerability. The impeccable mask of the successful, always in control, always confident businessman had fallen, never to return, revealing simply a frightened father and an adult son trying to care for his mother and his son at the same time, navigating completely unknown emotional territory. It took 2 long, silent weeks for Matthew to speak directly to his grandmother again. He moved through the house like a small ghost, present but absent, avoiding prolonged eye contact, turning away when Carmen tried to approach. She respected his space, as much as it hurt, understanding that the boy needed to process things in his own time and way. When he finally approached, it was on a rainy Saturday afternoon with the gray sky, pouring water over the mansion's gardens. Carmen was in the large living room, trying to crochet to occupy hands that trembled less now, but still betrayed the recent trauma. The boy appeared silently, barefoot on the cold marble, carrying the sketchbook he hadn't opened since that fateful day, and sat next to her on the enormous sofa without saying a word. They sat like that for long minutes that felt like hours, just side by side, listening to the insistent rain beat against the huge windows, each lost in heavy thoughts. Then, with slow, careful movements, Matthew opened the sketchbook and showed her a completely new drawing, different from anything he had done before. It was a majestic, detailed tree. But unlike the other trees he had drawn over the months, this one had deep, thick roots, fully visible above the ground, as if the earth were transparent, plunging deep into the dark soil, and the branches, which had been twisted and bare in his recent drawings, now had leaves, only a few, small and delicate, but they were definitely there, light green against the grey of the paper. "Trees can have ugly, bad roots," he said finally, his voice small and hesitant, but surprisingly firm in its conviction. "They can come from dark, sad places, but they can still grow new, beautiful leaves. They can still be strong trees." Carmen felt hot tears stream down her wrinkled face. She understood immediately and profoundly. The boy was processing, in his own unique and deep way, everything that had happened, the impossible complexity of the situation. He was desperately trying to find meaning in the absolute chaos his life had become. And that simple but powerful drawing was his way of saying that, despite absolutely everything, despite the origin shrouded in lies, despite the trauma and the pain, there was still hope. It was still possible to grow, to flourish, to be whole. "You saved Grandma," she said in a choked voice, carefully pulling her grandson into a hug he didn't refuse. "You were braver than any adult I know. You sent that video to your dad when you realized the danger. You saved me, my angel." Matthew let himself be hugged, finally melting into the warmth and safety of the embrace he had always known. "I was so scared. I thought I was going to lose you, but I couldn't. Leave you alone with her. I couldn't." They cried together then, holding each other tightly on the sofa as the rain continued outside. And in that shared cry was all the accumulated pain of everything they had lived through, all the trauma and fear and confusion, but there was also the silent, powerful promise that they would overcome it, somehow. Together. Always together. The following months were dedicated entirely to slow, careful reconstruction. Robert, with a determination that impressed everyone, drastically reduced his workload. He delegated important responsibilities to trusted executives, hired a full management team to take over daily operations, and reorganized his entire schedule to work from home at least 3 times a week, often more, He wanted to be truly present. He wanted to make up for the years he had been a father only in the scarce intervals of a relentless corporate routine, on rushed weekends during short vacations. He and Matthew began joint therapy, in addition to the intensive individual sessions each had with their respective specialized therapists. They learned, slowly and with difficulty, to talk honestly about feelings and fears, to share vulnerabilities without shame, to build a completely new father-son relationship based on radical honesty and true presence. Carmen also began her own therapeutic process. The psychologist, a serene and wise woman named Dr. Evans, who specialized in trauma in the elderly, patiently helped her process the deep trauma layer by layer, to deal with the persistent guilt of not having spoken up sooner about her discovery, to understand and accept that she had truly done the best she could under the absolutely impossible circumstances she was in. There was no instruction manual for that situation. There was no clear right answer. She had made difficult choices trying to protect everyone and had almost paid with her life for it. Gradually, session after session, the tremors in her hands lessened. The nightmares that woke her up screaming became less frequent and intense. And Carmen finally began to feel that she could breathe deeply again, that she could live without that crushing weight on her chest. The extensive and detailed investigation into Matthew's true origin revealed a deeply sad but crucial story to know. He had been the son of a 16-year-old girl, a girl who had gotten pregnant after her first serious relationship, completely unprepared for motherhood. Her family, extremely conservative and obsessively concerned with their reputation in the small community where they lived, had decided the baby would be given up for immediate adoption right after birth. But they wanted absolute and total secrecy. They didn't want to go through official adoption channels, didn't want bureaucracy, didn't want a paper trail. It was in this context that Julianne, through extremely dubious and likely criminal contacts she maintained in the underworld of illegal adoptions, obtained the baby completely illegally, without going through the proper legal procedures, without checks, without supervision. She paid a significant sum, forged medical documents and a birth certificate, and presented Matthew to Robert as their biological son. The teenager who had given birth never knew her son's fate, and Matthew had grown up completely unaware of this dark story of his origin. Robert, with the tireless help of specialized lawyers and private investigators, eventually managed to locate Matthew's biological mother. She was now 25, had married at 22 to a young man from her town, and had another child, a 2-year-old girl. She lived a simple but apparently happy life in rural Pennsylvania. When the investigators finally found her and gently explained the situation, when she learned that the baby she had been forced to give up at 16 was alive, well and loved, she literally fell to her knees and cried for hours. They were tears of relief, guilt, sadness and gratitude, all mixed in an uncontrollable emotional torrent. She confessed that not a single day in 9 years had passed without her thinking of that baby. She had never stopped wondering where he was, if he was okay, if he was happy, if he hated her for abandoning him. She carried a devastating guilt that she had never even shared with her husband. But when Robert visited her in person, when they talked for a long time one afternoon in a discreet cafe in her town, she made a difficult, but what she considered to be the right decision. She told Robert, with tears streaming but her voice firm, that she did not want to interfere in the boy's life at that moment. He had an established home, a father who loved him deeply and unconditionally, a dedicated grandmother, a routine, therapy, and stability. She didn't want to suddenly appear and cause more confusion, more trauma, more pain to a child who had already suffered so much. She didn't want to be selfish. She didn't want to take away the peace he was finally beginning to find. She only asked, with humility and restrained hope, that one day, when Matthew was older and emotionally and psychologically ready, when he was a teenager or a young adult and could process complex information, she could meet him, not as a mother, because she had never filled that role and would never try to claim it, but as the person who gave him life, as someone who had always cared and always would, even from a distance. She just wanted him to know that she existed, that she thought of him, that she cared, that the decision to give him up had not been hers but her family's, and that she had always regretted it. Robert, deeply moved by the maturity and generosity of this young woman, solemnly promised that when his son was truly ready, he would build that bridge with all care and love. 6 long months after the day that had almost marked the end of everything, Robert woke up one morning with a crystal-clear, powerful idea that would change not only his life but the lives of countless others. He had decided with absolute certainty to transform all that accumulated pain, all that suffering and trauma, into something positive and lasting. He would create an institute dedicated specifically to neurodivergent children, inspired directly by Matthew and the difficulties he had faced, a place where children like his son, sensitive, different, special in their unique ways of seeing and processing the world, could be not just accepted, but truly understood, unconditionally supported and celebrated in all their uniqueness. A place where difference was seen as a precious gift, not a problem to be fixed. A place where no child would feel wrong, inadequate or alone for thinking and feeling differently from the majority. The idea came in a casual but profound conversation with Carmen. They were in the kitchen on a quiet afternoon, making the traditional cornbread that had become a sacred ritual of connection between grandmother and grandson, when Robert, stirring the batter distractedly, said he couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. He couldn't go back to his old routine as if it were possible to forget. He urgently needed all that pain to generate something genuinely good, something that would make a real difference in the world. He needed a greater purpose. Carmen stopped beating the eggs and looked at her son for a long time. Then, with the simple wisdom of someone who had lived a long time and learned that transforming pain into love is the only real answer to suffering, she suggested something unexpected. Why not build the institute on the property itself, on the exact spot that had almost been the stage for an unspeakable tragedy, but which could now become a powerful symbol of rebirth and hope? Robert froze, the spoon suspended in midair, processing the suggestion. It was perfect. It was poetic. It was exactly what they needed, to literally transform the place of the near end into a place of new beginnings. He hugged his mother tightly, with deep gratitude, and in that embrace was all the love and admiration he had always felt for this extraordinary woman. And so began the ambitious project of the Matthew Institute, named in direct honor of the sensitive boy who, with his unique perception and impressive courage, had saved his grandmother and, in a profound way, saved the entire family from continuing to live a lie that was slowly poisoning them all. The architectural and implementation project took almost a full year of intense work. Robert hired the best architects specializing in therapeutic and educational spaces, interior designers with experience in environments for neurodivergence, and landscape architects who understood the importance of sensory gardens. They completely renovated the old farmhouse, maintaining its rustic charm, but modernizing the entire structure, transforming it into a welcoming and functional administrative headquarters. They built new, bright pavilions with large occupational therapy rooms, spaces dedicated exclusively to art therapy, an extensive library with specialized literature, carefully planned sensory gardens with plants of different textures, scents, and colors, and a music therapy area with soundproofing. Every detail was designed to welcome, to calm, to allow sensitive children to feel safe and understood. And in the specific area where that terrifying trench had once been, where Carmen had almost met her end, they created the memorial garden. Not as a morbid reminder of the trauma, but as a celebration of overcoming and life. They planted a sturdy, strong tree, a magnificent maple that would grow for decades and decades, its leaves turning vibrant colors every year as a symbol of renewal. Around it, perennial flowers, wooden benches. For contemplation, a small water feature with colorful koi. In the center, discreet but impossible to ignore, they placed a simple stone plaque with words that summarized their entire journey. Where there was pain, we cultivate love. Where there was a near end, we celebrate a new beginning. Throughout the long construction process, Julianne, from where she was serving her sentence after a first-instance conviction, sent a long letter to Carmen. It was 10 handwritten pages, the handwriting shaky, the paper stained with what looked like dried tears. It was a dense letter, full of desperate apologies and tortuous, confused explanations. She confessed everything again in painful detail, took responsibility for all her mistakes without trying to minimize them, and asked for forgiveness without really expecting or feeling she deserved it. She acknowledged, finally, with brutal honesty, that she had gone far beyond any acceptable limit, that the pathological fear of losing the lifestyle she had built on lies had led her to a dark, desperate place from which she couldn't return alone. And she made one final decision. She formally and definitively relinquished any legal rights to Matthew, signing official documents that acknowledged she had never been a real mother to him, only a temporary guardian based on fraud. She only asked that if Matthew ever asked about her, Robert would explain that she had loved him in her own twisted way, but that she had never known how to truly love. Carmen read the entire letter alone, sitting in the quiet garden of the mansion on a very windy afternoon. She cried as she read, not for Julianne, but for the complete human tragedy of a life built on lies and appearances, for the devastating loneliness of a woman who had everything material, but nothing real. She decided to reply not because Julianne deserved it or not, but because she herself, Carmen, needed that closure to move on in peace. She wrote a brief but honest letter. She said that complete forgiveness would take a long time, maybe years, maybe it would never come fully, and that was okay. But she sincerely hoped that Julianne would find some peace with herself in the time she had ahead, that she would use that painful time of imprisonment and consequences to finally become a better, more honest, more whole person, that she would look inward and understand what had led her to be capable of all that, and that perhaps one day she could do something good in the world to minimally compensate for the harm she had caused. Matthew, with the careful passing of months and the consistent work of specialized therapy, gradually began to draw regularly again, and the drawings changed completely in nature and essence. Now they were full of vibrant color, pulsating life, and genuine hope. He discovered, with the help of art teachers Robert had hired, that he had a real and significant artistic talent. He began to consciously use art as a powerful tool for emotional healing, expressing through lines and colors what he couldn't express in words. Over 6 months he created a complete and impressive series of illustrations about complex emotions, about processes of overcoming, about new beginnings after endings. And these illustrations, after being professionally framed, became a permanent part of the Institute's inspiring decor, touching and inspiring other children and families going through similar difficulties. Carmen, to her own surprise, took on an active and significant role at the Institute. It wasn't an official position, it wasn't paid, but it was absolutely essential to the emotional functioning of the place. She was there every week without fail, talking patiently with newly arrived families, sharing her own story of overcoming when she felt it could help, showing through her simple presence that overcoming was genuinely possible, that true love could rebuild, brick by brick, what lies had violently destroyed. Mothers constantly sought her out, asking for grandmotherly advice, asking to borrow her strength. And she, with the accumulated wisdom of someone who had lived much, suffered much, and survived the unimaginable, offered words of authentic comfort and real hope. A year and a half after the day that had almost marked her definitive end, Carmen was in the impeccably manicured garden of the Institute during the grand official opening. It was a sunny Saturday in September, an absolutely blue sky, a pleasant temperature, a gentle breeze. There were literally hundreds of people present, entire families of neurodivergent children who would be served specialized professionals from the mental health and special education fields, local authorities including the mayor and city council members, representatives from partner NGOs, and regional press covering the event. It was a historic day. The air was charged with positive expectation and genuine emotion. Robert, visibly nervous but radiant, with purpose, gave a deeply emotional speech of almost 20 minutes about the impossible journey that had brought them there. He spoke openly about pain and overcoming, about truth and reconstruction, about how the greatest tragedies can generate the greatest purposes when transformed with love. His voice broke several times, tears streamed down his face without shame, but he continued. And then, at the end, he called Matthew to the small stage set up in the garden. The boy, now a full 10 years old, taller, still shy but visibly stronger inside, was nervous but absolutely determined. He held with slightly trembling hands a carefully prepared paper with the speech he had written over weeks with the loving help of his therapist. With his voice trembling intensely at the beginning, but gaining strength and clarity as he spoke, and saw the attentive, loving faces of the audience, Matthew read, "This beautiful institute was born from a very, very big pain, the biggest pain we've ever felt, but it was also born from the strongest love there is. My grandma was almost lost forever, but she chose to live and fight. My dad lost a lot of certainties about his life, but he chose to start over with courage. And I learned even as a kid that real family isn't just about blood or genetics. It's about who truly loves you every single day. It's who stays by your side when everything falls apart and the world seems to end. It's who teaches you that being different isn't being wrong, it's being special and unique. I'm different. I see the world in a different way than other kids. And here, in this place, kids like me will learn that that's beautiful and doesn't need to be changed." The entire audience applauded, with emotional force, many crying openly, including Carmen, who was sitting in the front row next to Robert, holding his hand tightly. The boy had grown so much in such a short time. Not just in physical height, but in inner strength, in his ability to process pain and transform it into growth. He had survived the devastating trauma and was clearly becoming someone truly incredible. After the official ceremony, while people excitedly toured the impeccable facilities and explored every detail of the planned gardens, Carmen walked alone and slowly to the special tree in the memorial garden. She reverently touched the trunk, still relatively young but already visibly strong and healthy. She read the plaque for the 100th time, maybe the 1,000th, and each reading brought new meaning, a new layer of understanding, and she smiled. A truly genuine, complete smile from someone who had walked through the darkest possible valley and reached the other side, not just alive by chance, but genuinely renewed and with purpose. Robert approached silently, placing a hand with infinite affection on his mother's shoulder. "Thank you, Mom, for absolutely everything, for raising me alone when you had nothing, for coming to live with us even when it was so hard to adapt, for protecting Matthew even at the risk of your own life, for surviving when many wouldn't have. You are the strongest, bravest, most incredible person I know. You're my hero." Carmen squeezed her son's large hand on her shoulder, emotion overflowing. "We survive what we have to survive, my son. There's no choice. And when you do, you turn pain into love. That's exactly what we did. Together. Always together." Matthew joined them, completing the circle, and the three stood there in contemplative silence, holding each other tightly, looking at the tree that would grow majestically for decades as a living, permanent symbol of everything they had overcome together. In the months and years that followed that emotional inauguration, the Institute flourished in ways that surpassed even Robert's most optimistic expectations. Hundreds and then thousands of children were served with excellence. Entire families found support, understanding, and community. Professionals from all over the country were trained in new methodologies, and inspiring stories of overcoming and growth multiplied exponentially, each one unique, each one precious. Matthew grew and developed, becoming a genuinely talented and recognized young artist in his teens. Using his unique sensitivity, the same sensitivity that once made him feel wrong, he created works of art that touched hearts deeply, that made people cry with identification and hope. His exhibitions attracted crowds, and he directed a significant portion of the sales proceeds to the institute that bore his name. Robert finally found a real balance between work and personal life, something that had always seemed impossible. He understood, through pain and near loss, that true success is not measured only in accumulated wealth or corporate power, but in genuine presence, in demonstrated love, in a lasting positive impact on the world. He became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story and inspiring other entrepreneurs to rethink their priorities. And Carmen, to everyone's joy, lived for many more years, constantly surrounded by deep affection, a clear purpose, and the unshakable certainty that she had survived that terrible day for a reason much greater than herself. She became an almost legendary figure at the Institute and in the community, a living symbol of resilience and unconditional love. Children sought her out to hear stories, families hugged her, thanking her for existing, and she, always humble, would say she had only done what any grandmother would do: protect the ones she loves. The story of the family that almost shattered irreparably but consciously chose to rebuild itself on solid foundations of truth and unconditional love became a regional and then a national inspiration. Not because it was easy or simple, but precisely because it was terribly difficult and painful, because it shows with brutal honesty that it is possible, yes, to be reborn even after literally being almost buried alive. That the truth, however painful and destructive it may be initially, always liberates and heals in the long run. And that true love, the kind of love that doesn't depend on genetics, perfection, or conditions, is the most powerful force in the universe. Years later, when Matthew was a mature and settled young adult of 20, he decided he was finally emotionally ready to meet his biological mother. It was Carmen, now 80 but still lucid and present, who personally accompanied him on that meaningful encounter. They traveled together to rural Pennsylvania. The meeting was intense, full of tears on all sides, but also full of peace and understanding. The young woman and the young man talked for hours, sharing stories, filling in gaps, building a new and unique connection that didn't threaten anything that already existed. When they returned from that transformative trip, Matthew hugged Carmen for a long time at the airport and said, his voice choked but clear, "Grandma, now I understand everything completely. I have two different origin stories, one of blood that brought me into the world, and one of heart that taught me how to live in it. Both are important, both have value. But it was the story of the heart. It was you and Dad that truly defined who I am today." Carmen, her hair, now completely white as snow, and her hands deeply marked by a life lived, smiled that serene smile of someone who finally understands the meaning of it all. Love was always the answer, my angel. From the beginning, always, in every situation, in every dilemma, in every choice. It was always about love, and it always will be.